Hey everyone, happy Sunday evening and welcome into our latest TDR Sunday Night Small Cap Sunday podcast. I'm your host, Shad Dales. Hope you all had a great long holiday weekend, Thanksgiving weekend here in the US. I am your host, as I said, Shad Dales. Tonight, we're going to talk more about the psychedelic space. 2 weeks ago, we did a show on 4 companies we liked, and we followed up the next day with the CEO of Doug Drysdale from Cybin as to what's next. And if we've really removed ourselves from that whole Lycos therapeutic situation back in the summer, and if that hangover is over. But tonight, we want to walk you through 6 points as to what analysts look at when looking at this industry and really how it's going to attract institutional money. What are they? Well, let's welcome in TDR lead analyst, Bill McNarland, here on a Sunday evening. Hope you had a great long weekend. How are things?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, it was a great weekend. A little chilly, but all is well. How about yours?
It was lots of fun. Took my daughter to the U.S. Thanksgiving game with the Lions and Bears, followed by a Sunday or a Friday afternoon game with the Red Wings in Detroit. So she got spoiled, but it feels like the holiday season now. And I think it's kind of like the unofficial holiday kickoff when the U.S. Thanksgiving weekend kicks off. But yeah, still a lot of stuff that we're trying to drum up here with regards to cannabis and most importantly, the psychedelic space. But it's garnering more and more attention, as you can probably see over these last couple of weeks, right?
Oh yeah, fantastic. And it's there's a process for this industry as well, which we're going to look at.
Yes.
Some of the finer details, kind of like in the Lions and Bears game, the importance of calling a timeout at the very end
What
can
was
cost
that?
your job.
Nice
Like
weekend for
I
him,
don't know
huh?
much about football, but that one seemed like a basic one.
Well, the section that I was in, there was probably fans 10 rows in front of me and behind me, and we all kind of looked around to see if there was a flag on the field because it was just a very bizarre ending, and we were wondering if, like, there was a timeout that was called or something, but it wasn't until probably 30 to 45 seconds after the game ended that the referee came out and announced that the game is over, and it was kinda like a slow hesitation, and then after that, it was euphoria, but one of the strangest endings to a game, the worst clock management I think I've seen as a football fan, but, uh feel bad for the guy. Nothing like getting laid off on a Friday on Thanksgiving weekend. How was your Thanksgiving weekend? That's rough. Rough
Yeah,
business. But
yeah.
listen, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, RFK was named the head of the HHS, who later announced some positive comments for the psychedelic industry, knowing his stance on the research he feels is needed, and along with his long stance and how he views the whole pharma industry being, I guess, in a lot of ways, the root cause as to why he feels America is one of the sickest countries in the world. So, with that, we highlighted 5 stocks in the industry 2 weeks ago. And tonight we're going to walk you through 6 points to your knowledge before investing in any of them that are most likely, as we've said before, not generating revenue right now. So, I think the whole idea is just to really get inside an analyst's head and understand what these 6 points are. But would you find, before we get into details, the big takeaway when doing this research, Bill?
It's an up and coming area still, and I just think if the companies, the larger, if the smaller companies can follow the path of the larger companies in the best practices and
Yeah.
such, there's a lot that they can do to do better, and would help an analyst to be able to uncover their story. And I think also other things if you look different types of analysis, there's some really interesting opportunities price wise that may be overlooked on first glance.
Yeah, as you said in some of your notes, some high flyers that we're going to watch, and interesting to see on how you should proceed looking at some of these companies. So first up, let's talk about the lay of the land and where we are right now, and a chart we want to show you as to where the industry currently sits right now. As of November 2024, there's 24 companies with over a $2 million market cap, 18 psychedelic microcap companies, 6 small cap, and currently none who are mid to large cap. So as far as stocks performance out of the 24 companies you researched on, which company currently has had the best 1 year return?
Well, Brightmind was over 3,400%. That's a wild one.
High flyer.
Yeah, so you can see, the medium return is around the Mind Bio and Compasses around a loss of 9% on the year,
Yeah,
but it's all over the map. So this is interesting if you're a trader and you're interested in this market. There can be great opportunities for volatility. It's something, but then also to note when to purchase as a long-term investor
exactly.
as well. So there's a lot of opportunity here. Interesting for sure.
On the flip side, which companies had the worst 1 year return?
Yeah, Inveracat was down 72%. And these
72.
names will
Wow.
change. They'll go up and down.
They will.
Who's up and who's not. And so it's some love chasing the great returns, and they feel the highs will keep going higher. But there's interesting opportunities in the companies that have been really beat up that potentially still have a feasible business model.
Okay, so let's dive into these 6 points and review point number one. We want to highlight an important one. I think one that many investors may seem is not that important, but it is, and that comes to company presentations. So, why do you think differently when most people think it's not that important?
Well, first of all, as an analyst, the first thing you're going to have access to is the company's financial performance in the past. Okay, yeah, everyone has that, and it doesn't look that
Yep.
great for a lot of these companies because they don't have revenue yet. So then you want to figure out what is going to happen in the future, and so management can only make approved statements through press releases or through analyst calls, but they also can share what their company's doing through a presentation deck that's approved often by their legal counsel that is accurate. And analysts, that's great. You can look at, you can see everything about the company is doing, their views, how their drug development is. But it's a mystery to me that especially some of the smaller companies don't publish this
Yeah.
information for investors. And what happens is an analyst is going to look at a smaller name. Like what typically happens is there's someone at a family office or an investment fund that tells the analyst, "Tell me everything about psychedelic companies in 4 days." And so they're going through this information. They're just going to skip over the companies that don't have the information available.
It
And another
surprises me.
example, yeah,
Yeah, it
go
surprises me, obviously, in a brand new industry that's trying to emerge, but make it turnkey and easy as possible for obviously analysts. And a lot of people might say, well, obviously, yeah, that makes sense. That's common sense. But there are some companies that have not done this. Why do you think that is?
I think maybe they don't understand the importance, so they don't have a background what it's like to work as an analyst. They don't know how important it is. Secondly, there's some strangeness where some company executives feel that this is confidential information. They're a public company. And,
Good
there's one
point.
company. I sent a request for a deck, and they approved me to see the deck like a week later. It's a public company. There's nothing confidential to a point. Maybe their plans are, but they can easily disclose the public information that they normally would
Yeah.
disclose on analyst calls. Make it easy. And the leaders do this. You look at companies like MindMed or Compass or Atai, they right away after their earnings call, they have an up-to-date presentation on the company, and you can see everything in an easy to see, really easy for an analyst. You can see why the smaller companies that don't have it get skipped over.
Yeah, it makes sense. So the big takeaway here is that you wouldn't waste your time if this is something they do not have, especially when you factor in how many public companies are currently registered across North America. And there's a lot and has been a lot, especially when you look over the last 5 to 10 years as to how many companies have gone public. So there's your first point is company presentations. May seem small, but an extremely important one if you want analyst coverage. Okay, point number two, and there are many companies in this space that have the advantage of being listed on the big board exchanges, something the cannabis industry, as we know, doesn't have the luxury of being at right now at this time. So, besides the obvious, meaning access to institutional money, give us more reasons on the main difference when listing on a big board exchange versus an OTC listing. And what'd you find that would really grab the attention of an analyst when looking at, the two exchanges?
For myself, I find it irrelevant if a company is on the OTC or on the big board, as long as they have audited financial statements. I'm looking at the company. Doesn't really matter to myself. But there's still a huge stigmatism in the institutional industry and sophisticated investors over it. I'm going to give you an example. I was working on a project for a family office recently that they wanted to do some mergers and acquisitions in the real estate industry. And
Okay.
so they tasked me to go find some companies that they could acquire. But they gave me a mandate saying, it has to be on the big board, NASDAQ or NYSE, or it could
Yep.
be a private company, but just don't bring anything on the OTC. And
Okay.
I question that. It's like, well, an OTC company, most of them have, they have audits. It's up to date information. The filings are there. The private company may not have anything, but that just was their stigmatism. And this was very
So they'd
sophisticated
rather
individuals.
go. they'd rather go the route of a thriving private company versus a proper OTC listing company. Is that correct?
That was their view, and the private company didn't necessarily have updated information, had no reporting requirements and such. And you're just kind of sitting there and you're like, well, this is an intelligent group of individuals, this is their opinion, but there still is this stigmatism. So it's very interesting for these
What is that
psychedelic companies
stigmatism?
that have the vibe.
What is that
Well, I think it just
stigmatism
goes
amongst
back to the
analysts?
old days. It just goes back to the old days. These used to be pink sheets. These you had a piece of paper, and you're looking, finding out with this company. There's no real information, but regulations changed a long time ago, where the
Yeah,
OTC listing is not much different from the big board, but there's still a stigmatism there.
yeah. So some
So
of the
because
notable
of that, the
names,
psychedelics have an advantage. Go ahead.
yeah, some of the notable names currently listed on big board exchanges. So you got MindMed, you've got Cybin, you've got Atai, you've got Compass. Who else am I thinking at the top of my head right now?
Uh,
There's tons.
Incanics, Clear Mind. There's a whole bunch. So it's very common they can get this because they are saying they're going down an FDA route of trying to get something approved. And so what they have is not legally approved, but they're going down a path, just like all drug development. So they're
Yeah.
allowed to get the big board approval. So this
How
is
do
something
American
that does have an advantage.
how do American analysts view big board exchanges like the TSX? You look at somebody like a Numinous Wellness, for example, listed on the TSX. Is that considered like, a lot of us do classify that as the big board, access to institutional money. But when you look at Canadian analysts, obviously you're going to take that exchange very serious. I'd be curious to see what American analysts and how they view it.
There's no standardized opinion. Just like
Okay.
the story I was telling you with a sophisticated group in the US that viewed OTC as completely suspect, there's some people view Canada as completely suspect. So there's no standard. When people think,
For
well,
obvious reasons.
institutions view things like this, it's not. It's just all over the map depending on what the organization is like.
Okay. So again, we want to repeat the top 5 or 6 big board exchanges. You've got Atai, you've got Compass, you've got MindMed, you've got Cybin, you've got which GH Research, they're on the Nasdaq, correct?
Yes.
So those are,
Incanics,
yep.
Inveric.
If I'm yeah, and if I'm missing any, feel free to leave some comments below, people. But yeah, just a quick run through, which I think a lot of people are up to speed on, the difference between having access to a big board exchange versus an OTC listing. Okay. Point number 3, this is accounting, and more importantly, how they're spending their money on research and development. You want to explain more?
Yeah, so research and development is key for these companies, and it's an indicator that they're spending it wisely. You want these companies to be spending a lot on R&D, and this can be an idea of how likelihood they're going to have a breakthrough. And you want to be kind of suspect if a company is in this space and is spending hardly anything on R&D, then there's not likely to be a breakthrough on it. But what's really different is a lot of the leadership is in countries outside of the US. It's a lot is
Yeah.
in in Europe and such. And for example, in Europe and Canada, R&D is considered something that can be capitalized or it's an asset. It's not an expense like it is in the US. So even companies that are in other countries that list in the United States on the big board, their accounting may actually be capitalizing it. So it's really hard to tell sometimes if you just take typical software to say if you go on Yahoo Finance to say how much is a company spending in R&D, you may not find it in the income statement. So it's a caution to investors saying this is something very important to consider, but it may not be as easy as you think how to find this information.
Okay, so research costs, development costs that ultimately impact their EBITDA is what the main goal is here, correct?
So some countries typically the R&D may not affect EBITDA, and some it will. And so this can give you a false sense of how well a company is doing or not doing based on their costs. So I'm just saying you have to do deeper research on this
Okay.
area to make sure you're comparing apples to apples in the companies that you're looking at.
So when you look at you have to do further research. So what kind of digging do you have to do? Do you find it challenging? And if so, why or how?
No, I don't find it challenging because I've been
No?
doing this for years. It's just more time consuming. So I have to check if I see a line item on income statement. I just check to make sure on the balance sheet is there something else there that's being capitalized, and then if it is, I have to do my own adjustments in Excel. That's fine. But I just would say this is such an important area, which we'll see in the next point. I would just caution investors that deeper analysis is important.
Okay. All right. Let's now move to point number 4, which is reach spend to marginal cost. Can you explain what you mean by this and why it's interesting?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the R&D spending compared to the market cap, which is really interesting because how much are, we see some companies have taken off and they're huge, but an
Yeah.
indicator of whether they're going to maintain that is going to be based on how much R&D spending that they have, because that's going to be their future success. So
Right.
what I'm looking for here is if there's a company that has spent huge on R&D and their market cap's really low, maybe next year and the next year after that, there's going to be an approval come out of all that R&D money that was spent in the past. But if there's a company with a huge market cap
Yeah.
and it's not spending anything on R&D, well, then there's a risk that it's not going to maintain that because nothing's going to come out of their pipeline. So
Right.
I've never seen this anywhere, but what I do is I like to take the market cap of the company and
Okay.
divide it out by the last 12 months of R&D spending. And if I get a really low ratio, that's something that can be extremely interesting that could cause the stock to pop next year or the year after. If this ratio is extremely high, that tells me, let's do a little bit more digging. That's a yellow flag to look at. So
So the ups Yeah, go finish your
go
thought.
ahead. Yeah. No.
I was gonna say the upside potential, as you said, is still coming, and the benefits, if they come through, to eventually be purchased. But careful when reviewing this for a company to be bought, especially when you factor in, so as you like to call it, some of the recent high flyers. And that obviously is one stock that comes to mind is like Bright Minds Bioscience, which has been up. How much was it? Over 3,000%?
Yeah, well, 3,000%. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So outline, I guess, maybe some of the examples that relate to this point that you want to highlight.
Yeah. So let's pull up a chart here. So we have something like Inveric Bioscience. Last year, they spent $1 of R&D compared to their market cap. So that's huge. Their whole market cap right now, they spent in R&D in the last year.
Wow.
In Canex, 50 cents on the dollar approximately.
Okay.
Their market cap today, if it's a dollar, they spent 50 cents on R&D in last year. But
Which
you look
normally
at
is
the,
what? 20%?
oh, yeah, something like that, or not. It probably, you probably 10%.
Okay.
So this shows you how either beat up the stock is, or people are discounting this. But you look at something like Brightmind, it's trading for 224 times what it spent on R&D in the last 12 months.
Which doesn't add up.
Yeah. So this is my ratio. I haven't seen it used, but this is what I'm looking for, the ratio of R&D spent compared to market cap. And this tells me that Inveric, Incanix, Compass, Awaken, Revive are companies that are in the top five. And this is something, a lot of those names we don't talk about all the time.
Mhm.
But that's really interesting.
Yeah. Any other well, he basically outlined 4 or 5 companies right there, but, it's an interesting point to say the least. So why don't you think more analysts, as far as, looking at this space and looking at a stat like this, is not I don't wanna say they're not looking at this correctly, they're just not looking at it as far as the overall industry yet, but when they do, something like this is gonna be the one of the first things that comes to mind, correct?
Yeah, but there's and we'll talk about this when we go to point six a little bit, but there's a lot of analyst coverage
Yep.
in psychedelics, way more than cannabis. And we'll talk about why that is and potentially why this is overlooked. But I think this is the main statistic. If an investor can figure out what the actual R&D spent is because of the difference in accounting, but when they get to that point, this is the big ratio to look at. And I think more institutions that are investing their own money are looking at these types of stats.
Okay. Well, we'll learn that in just a moment. All right. Second last point when it comes to analysts reviewing, researching psychedelic companies. Point number 5, the amount of conditions that companies are working to treat is astounding. And that's putting it mildly. So, what research trials come to mind when treating, I guess, a lot of the treatments that are going on right now? Like, what stands out to you most as an analyst when looking at certain trials, basically focusing on certain conditions as to what they're doing?
It's interesting that it's all over the map. So we know that there's mental health benefits, so it's no surprise
Yep.
there's anxiety and depression that is up there. But it's interesting that there's such things also as helping people with sleep apnea, which is interesting. Maybe something we didn't think of as first. But I think the addiction area is the area that's really intriguing
Big.
because we have such a problem in the news, and especially in the United States, we see this currently with the change of leadership. There's a lot of talk about the issues with addiction right now with opiates. So I'm really excited about how potentially that can help.
So when we look at further to that, depression and anxiety are also at the forefront. So there are a number of trials pertaining to these type of conditions right now. So how do you differentiate one trial from one company compared to another one when it comes to, relatively similar same conditions? Do you know?
Yeah, how I would look at it is how well funded is the company and how far are they into the phase. So a company that is not well funded, that's trying to solve depression or anxiety, and they're in phase 1 or 2, that's going to be a long road ahead. But we
You
know
need
that
money.
some of the companies are way later in the trials, and they're well funded. But it is
So
it is it is it's really wonderful to see because this research will be used in the future, whether or not some of these companies make it. But it's amazing to see just the world progressing in trying to solve these problems.
So a lot of retail investors, when it comes to education, they're going to know that. Obviously, differentiating the two is, how much money basically is in the war chest and how much money have you raised. Those are important ones. And, I think a lot of people are aware of that. But outside of that, nothing else really comes to mind as far as differentiating one trial, say, versus another when it comes to fixating on the same kind of condition.
Yeah, I think it's how, like, for example, there's different levels. Like, postpartum depression is different
Yeah.
from manic depression. So it's just there's so many categories, which, and also they're interrelated. Typically, a lot of times people that have anxiety also have some depression issues as well.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to see how broad it is, but there's a lot of individual categories that people feel there's more likely that the company can get through the trials if it's not as broad in what they're trying to treat.
Yeah, another big one, PTSD, with over 13 million Americans currently dealing with PTSD, which is a pretty staggering number. When you look back at the summer as an analyst and you see the way everything kind of unfolded and the way Lycos conducted their trials, there was a hangover. There was a dark cloud over this industry for a number of months, but it didn't really affect and had no kind of correlation between any of the other drug development companies and the trials like the Cybins of the world. Saying that, if you're an analyst and you saw the results and the way these trials were conducted, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
I'm contemplating with psychedelics how it is true that people need some aftercare to make the psychedelic effective.
Okay,
And likely that has to be attached to the trial. And that's
correct.
very interesting because if I have acid reflux, I don't need to see another person to make it work. And this is very difficult when dealing with the FDA, of course. And I see this, but I know it's true because there's many people that have had recreational psychedelic use and have had no positive benefit from it. So it's also the way that it's framed to cause the healing. And so this is a very difficult area that has to be acknowledged and looked at. So the best is to have clinical trials that don't require that and that are showing success without additional intervention.
Yes. When I look at that, it's like, are you powerless over the substance or are you powerless over the way you look at life and how you deal with it? And I think when you factor in MDMA and like the assisted therapy that's required, it's all about getting to the root of the problem as to why you're doing, and most importantly, how you handle a lot of life's situations. And until you understand that, you can understand from a recreational standpoint, it's not nearly as effective or even effective at all from what I can see and hear and learn from. But interesting points to say the least about how an analyst would view based on those latest, results from Lycos. Curious to see what happens to that company moving forward. Do you think that they get big pharma? You know, they're going to have a tough time raising money. Maybe they do, but heading into 2025, does a big pharma company, as you said, shelf, a buyout like this? They look at the extensive research that they did. Is this a prime candidate for a buyout, or have they missed their opportunity? Like, how would you view something like that?
I think thankfully, well, I would say I'm glad that everyone that put money toward Lycos, whether it was through a not-for-profit idea or was through or to make an investment, to get that science forward, it has progressed and it's helped. I think a lot of the science that was moved forward is public information. So I would imagine that it would be unlikely that there's a very large sum of money come after what has been established from that company.
Yeah, which makes me curious to see if a pharma company looks at that data and sees its value, and if so, because of the challenge of raising money, if they are a buyout target. But we shall see moving forward. Finally, our last point comes to an analyst coverage for psychedelic companies is point number 6, and that's thought leadership. You mentioned 2 weeks ago on the show when it comes to pharma companies, they buy out startups, and when they do, they look at IP, they look at data, and also an important one, if they like the team and management that's basically been assembled with the company. So, what are some notable things you look for when reviewing some of the larger companies in the space that usually have you analyst coverage? Like, what did you learn through this?
There's a huge amount of analyst coverage, and that's way more than cannabis. And that's because biotechs always have to raise money. And when
Yeah,
you start a biotech, you do not say, let's raise the money to get through the next 10 years. It's let's raise money to get through the next step. And so there's some, if you can prove out that you've done
makes sense.
well, a lot of companies want to invest. And so the investment bankers are like, yes, let's stay on this story, let's produce research, and let's bid for that investment banking business. So because of that, there's tons of coverage. Potentially, investment banks looking at biotechs that are going to be clients of theirs in the future, there could be inherent conflict in the research. So I don't think the thought leadership necessarily comes from the investment banking analysts. Um, so when you're looking for thought leadership, I don't see a lot. Like if you go to somewhere like Seeking Alpha or something, there's tons of
Yeah.
individuals covering cannabis companies and such and large ones, and some have credible opinions, some not so much. But there's not a lot covering psychedelics at all because it's complicated area to cover. And also, I don't see a lot with the thought leadership in psychedelics. Typically, aren't people that have finance backgrounds. There is some great thought leadership, and I read some of the thought leadership every day. But it wouldn't be people that have a finance background. And so, when these are investments, it would be better to find someone that had a thought process that's finance related. I don't see that right now. Cannabis has quite a bit of it, but not in psychedelics.
So, do you think more change, a lot of change still needs to happen at the leadership level for a lot of these companies?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think it's getting a lot better. I have noticed that there's more of the serious investors are taking a look and less of the people that maybe are viewing this as a life-changing opportunity outside of the actual investment thesis. So I
Yeah.
think this is becoming a more serious biotech type area. And I'm super excited about this. This is the time where it's more for serious investors going forward.
Yeah. So the biggest difference between analyst coverage between the cannabis space and the psychedelic space is it's biotech and it's here and now and what next steps when it comes to raising money, which we all know this is where a lot of shops are making their money now. And flip side to that is that you're getting research coverage immediately, where cannabis is longer term down the road, which doesn't have as much appeal to analysts, correct?
Yeah. So with cannabis, it's not looked positively if you're constantly going to raise money.
No, at
Biotech,
all.
it is. It means
Right.
because you got to your next target. And so there's lots of capital there that wants to fall if you get to your next target. If you need to raise money in cannabis, it's not something, it's hard to do for an investment bank. If your business is not doing well, you need to raise money. That's a tough investment banking assignment. It's
Yeah.
not in biotech. So that's why there's so much analyst coverage going toward biotech.
Duly noted, and thank you for outlining that. So, for example, how many research firms are providing coverage for some of the bigger companies, say like MindMed, arguably the most sought after company right now in the space?
Yeah, I saw MindMed has 8 different analysts. At TI, I think has around 12. Compass, very well covered as well. So there's a lot of investment banking interest in these companies as they're going through, but it drops off really quickly after you're out of the top 6 or 7 companies, where essentially there is very limited research of any kind on these companies.
Okay, so when we see a company like Bright Minds Bioscience, knowing how much the stock has moved over the last 30 days, does it have coverage? If so, what are we looking at?
It was two smaller companies are following the story with them. So, and then after that, it gets very, very slim on most of the companies.
Yeah. What about Cybin? They probably have a healthy amount of research as well.
I don't have the Simon stats here, but I know that there was a number of investment banks covering them as well.
Okay. So outside of investment banks and here at TDR, where we provide research, how would you best describe the overall space when it comes to leadership compared to where you've been historically investing in before? Like, what's the current state of affairs for this space and for it to grow in 2025, especially when you think about potentially some positive momentum building with how RFK is going to view this and, ultimately who he's going to be working with once they name the leader of the DEA come next year?
Yeah, I think we need some more thought leadership. I think, especially on the analyst side, to be able to talk credibly about companies. I think there's good thought leadership in the media and the research side. There's some very credible reporting that comes out about psychedelics, but it's just not finance based. So I think that's a need, and I think that'll happen as there's more interest, especially when there's, it's in the media every day currently about the change of leadership in the U.S. and how potentially it can benefit pushing forward agendas with psychedelics.
So, what would need to happen from RFK to announce to garner, I guess, the attention that many people are hoping to get more and more research coverage and more awareness for the overall space out of New York? What do you think will happen or needs to happen, I should say, out of Washington to kind of turn the corner and a lot of this hopium that we're talking about with the overall space? Like, what do you think that he would need to basically announce in order for this to garner even more attention from currently where it sits right now?
I think veterans is a huge area of concern for everyone in the country. So keeping focused on how it's helping veterans. The actual political maneuvering, as you've seen in cannabis in the last 18 months, it was a very confusing landscape on a week to week basis of what actually had to be done for different levels of legalization. And I think
Yeah,
psychedelics will be equally a situation as
challenging.
well. And so you look at this gentleman, um, uh, he doesn't have the absolute authority to be making radical changes. It still have to go through checks and balances, and he still has to keep his job there as well.
Yeah.
So it's going to be something, a great interest, but the analysis is going to be similar to cannabis, just like you've been talking about for the last 18 months or so. There's been a lot of stories that have been moving the path in different directions to the approval.
Hence the reason why we've had a few interviews with CEOs recently, and they're not paying much attention as to what's going on in Washington, which I get because ultimately, at the end of the day, as you said, some great information as far as headlines and stories. But when it comes to push, a fact, something being passed, look, he has the authority. He's going to be working with the DEA, and there's a lot of things that basically he can put across his desk and sign off, being the head of the HHS. But like you said in the past, like, what is this working relationship going to be like with President-elect Donald Trump? And over time, I learned this week that big pharma, the overall industry, is producing anywhere between 750 and $800 billion of revenue annually. So this is not even a topic of conversation. But to your point, if there is some data and there is compelling data as far as buyout targets, you think that, as you've said before, they would look at this, go about this quietly, buy it, shelf it for a couple of years, and just be part of the conversation. Is that what people can anticipate or expect if there is big pharma entering into this space?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think you're on a right path there, and it's going to take some time, but definitely there's interest. I can guarantee you the pharma companies are very closely watching this and have committees at the companies that are watching these developments because they're motivated by greed. And greed is going to bring them down this path if there's an opportunity to monetize it.
100%. especially with this new administration. Well, let's bring on 2025 and see what it brings. But Bill, in the meantime, appreciate obviously the walkthrough. What'd you all think? Did you like the walkthrough? Do you have any questions, any other information you want to learn from? Leave us some comments below. I'd love to get your feedback, but we hope these 6 points give you a better understanding as to what analysts look for when looking at this overall industry and specific companies in the psychedelic space. Bill, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll check back in with you next week, okay?
Sounds good. Take care.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Thanks again for watching. Hey, we're humming along, and it's all because of you and the audience and community that we're building. So, again, make sure to smash on that like button and leave lots of comments. Who do we have up next? You let us know. Who should we interview? What companies? Is there anything you like? Is there anything we're missing? We're all here for you. Let's get on with each other and build this community for all of us to benefit. As usual, don't forget to subscribe to our channel because in the end, we wouldn't be here without you. Thanks again, everyone.